When the town was settled in 1780, they laid it out in lots and actually had it surveyed by 1789. But before 1789, people were dying and needed to be buried. And these two lots were kept aside and utilized as the city graveyard. Cemetery is the term we normally use now, but graveyard was often used in the earlier years. A lot of people comment on our boxes. These are called sarcophagi. And what they are stone protection. They are built, they're open at the bottom, covering the grave that's in the ground. The grave is not above ground. They're not inside this box. The actual grave is in the ground, and then it's protected by the stone box on top. And this kept the animals from digging in graves. Now we think animals, but we had the pigs ran wild. The animals were not enclosed like we do today. And there was a thought that this was a way of protecting the newly buried corpse by putting these stone boxes on top. This is the only cemetery we have that have them, but there are numerous ones here, and over the years there have been others that have broken it and fallen apart. About 5 years ago, the city of Bardstown got a grant to do a lot of repair on this, because this cemetery has not been used since 1856, when the land north of town was purchased for a new municipal cemetery. Many different Revolutionary War veterans are buried here. Revolutionary War in the 1770s. Those veterans came to Bardstown to settle in Nelson County, and when they died, they are buried here. And later in the 1900s, there was a lot of emphasis on locating the veterans of the American Civil Revolution. So they would come and locate where they were buried, and then they would put tombstones up for them. So this new tombstone we were looking at is actually from the last 40 years, denoting Alexander McCowan, who was a soldier of the Revolution. Many graves have been lost here with the fact that they did not have markers. Those that had markers, and those that we know about from the 1800s that were researched in the 1930s. There's a cemetery list of the people buried here, and they're everything from merchants to blacksmiths, and as I said, old soldiers. It's a beautiful, quiet spot here in Bardstown, and again goes back to the 1780s. Alexander McCowan is known locally from the fact that he was the friend of John Fitch, and it would be in his home that John Fitch died in 1797. John Fitch, of course, is the inventor of the steamboat. Needless to say, many people said Robert Fulton did this. Well, our documents show, and the U.S. Congress acknowledged, that John Fitch was operating a successful steamboat on the Delaware River in 1788, 20 years before Fulton would get his off the ground, or should I say off the water, down the water. Fitch actually showed Fulton his ideas, his models, but Fitch had a patent on this. And the sad tale of John Fitch is that he was 20 years ahead of his time. It was too early for the federal government to realize that the waters of the West, the Ohio, Mississippi, Missouri, would be the main highways for commerce and development and migration. And they did not realize the difference that a boat propelled by steam being able to come back up those huge rivers, what a difference that would make in the future of America. It would be very close to this tombstone where John Fitch was first laid to rest in 1797. There was no marker to mark his grave, but the son of Alexander McCowan had told his son about it, and when it came time in 1927 to disinter the remains of John Fitch to be put in the monument on the court square, the grandson came out and noted where the grave was, as told him by his father and his grandfather. So without a marker, and without the oral history being handed down from father to son, they would not have been able to find the bones of John Fitch and honor his memory and his accomplishments on the Bardstown Court Square. It was an exciting day in 1927 when the Army and the townspeople and the John Fitch descendants were here to unveil this wonderful monument in his honor. He was definitely an unsung hero in that he didn't get attention or any financial gains from his invention. It would be later that his idea and his invention would really make a difference in American history. Under this monument lie the bones that were taken from the Pioneer Cemetery. His great-great-grandson was here to acknowledge the honor to his father. The Daughters of the American Revolution, John Fitch chapter, because John Fitch was a soldier in the Revolution. They presented a meal later, and this was quite an event in Bardstown's history. And they placed it on the court square because everyone who comes to Bardstown comes around the court square. This is the center of our community, and so there's a lot of activity that goes on here, and this is where they knew that he would have the largest number of visitors and acknowledgement. In the 1970s, the John Fitch chapter of the DAR had this replica constructed. Now, the replica is a smaller version of the steamboat that actually operated on the Delaware River in 1788. And it doesn't look to us like any steamboat, but the oars were on the side. There were belts that went from gears to where it picked up the oars, moved them forward, put them back into the water, and moved them back. And it was like having a rowboat without any rowers, so to speak. And the steam came from a small engine, power came from the engine that caused these gears and belts to move. This is an example of the second stage of log building. This is known as the Yoakum Height House. Yoakum was the first person we find owning it. The Heights lived in here in many years, so that's where you get the two names. These are yellow poplar logs. They're very thick, as you can tell. You can imagine what the trees they came from. But this squared off log, very finely fitted together, nice windows, small panes. This wasn't built in the first 5 years of Bardstown settlement, which we had the crude cabins. This would have been built by 1788. It was covered with clapboard early. It wasn't left open like this, like we see. And the reason being, if you had the money, you were building a fine house, you finished it off by covering it up with the clapboard to protect it, keep it warmer, and keep the insects and all out. We know it was worth a lot of money, but it wasn't sold for money in 1797. It was sold for beef cattle, pounds of beef cattle, 152 pounds of merchantable beef bought this house in 1792. When the clapboard was taken off the front of the house in the 1970s, they wanted to take off the side here to expose the side of the log house. But when they did, when they pulled this old clapboard off, they found that underneath the logs had been scorched or burned. The fire of 1856 that started across the corner here, the wind pushed flames over, scorching the wood on this building, probably burning the clapboard and then burning some of the logs. So when they uncovered the burnt logs, they realized that was not going to be very attractive to show the public. So they went back and put the clapboard back on. So that's why only the front is exposed. Probably the clapboard kept that building from burning down because it took some of the scorch before it got to the really structure, the main part of the building. The 1856 fire blew north across this street, going up 2.5 blocks, destroyed over 20 buildings, a church, and some commercial buildings. It was put out by the efforts of our volunteer fire department, the students from St. Joseph College, and all the homeowners coming to pass buckets and pump water. That was the biggest fire in Bardstown until the 1900s. And with better equipment, we were able to fight the fires in 1900, but that was quite devastating to a town of our size in 1856.